This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 311 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Guys, last week's matchup show was the worst matchup show that I think I've ever done. I whiffed on a lot of players. You don't have to go back and listen. I'm telling you right now, variance hit me hard this past week. Robbie Anderson wasn't close to what I thought he would be. Neither was Allen Robinson. I wasn't aggressive enough with my Buffalo backfield evaluation for week 9 specifically. Kyler Murray ended up being a good fantasy option. The list goes on. Yeah, this is a process over results game. But last week's results were trash. And I apologize if I led you in the wrong direction. Week 9 is not the norm. Now, before making up for last week by talking through some players I'm higher and lower on versus the consensus for this one, I want to let you guys know about FanDuel's Thursday night NFL contest, appropriately called the Thursday Night Special. Make a lineup full of Raiders and Chargers players and enter that lineup for just $9. You'll have a chance at $800,000 worth of prizes, including a $200,000 first place prize. Visit FanDuel.com to enter. I think Jimmy Garoppolo is in play again this week after a great Week 9 performance. Seattle has allowed the 10th most fantasy points per game this year to opposing quarterbacks, but only 2 of the 8 quarterbacks that they've faced who have started and finished a game, because they did face Pittsburgh when Ben Roethlisberger got hurt, 2 of those 8 quarterbacks ended up scoring below their season-long average. They haven't faced the toughest quarterback competition. And since facing Andy Dalton, the combination of Big Ben and Mason Rudolph, and then Teddy Bridgewater across the first 3 weeks of the season, the 6 quarterbacks who have gone up against Seattle have all ranked as top 14 weekly options, averaging 19.6 fantasy points per game. FanDuel Sportsbook has this game with a 47-point over-under, and San Francisco has a pretty high 26.5-point implied team total. Jimmy G should be a solid option this week. I also don't mind Ryan Tannehill. I saw he was ranked below Sam Darnold on Fantasy Pros this week, but I'm not sure how we can feel that confident. Not only is Tannehill's matchup not that bad against Kansas City, but Tannehill's also been QB 14, QB 10, and QB 6 in each of his last 3 starts, or each of his only 3 starts this year. Darnold's ranked higher than QB 21 once in 5 games. But back to the matchup. Tannehill gets a Kansas City defense that's allowing the 11th most fantasy points per game this year to opposing quarterbacks. And it's in a game with a 48.5-point over-under. The Titans are underdogs at home, and that might not be all that bad of a thing, because they may not be able to be their typical run-heavy selves. On the year, they have a 1.19 pass-to-rush attempt ratio overall, but in neutral game scripts, that rises to 1.36, so they're more pass-heavy when games are close. To me, Ryan Tannehill is one of the top streamers this week. And then regardless of who's under center for Indianapolis, you should feel confident about them against Miami. The Dolphins were fine last week against Sam Darnold, but they've still allowed the 4th highest yards per attempt rate this season, and Indy has a 27.25-point implied team total. If they score that many points, the quarterback is going to have something to do with it. So even if Brian Hoyer starts, I think that he's in play if you aren't able to get someone like Ryan Tannehill. Now on the other side of things, I think it's fair to wonder if Jared Goff can live up to his fringe QB1 ranking this week. The Rams are coming off a bye, so that gives me some hesitation, but going to Pittsburgh and facing this Steelers defense won't be the easiest task in the world. Pittsburgh hasn't allowed a performance higher than QB 16 since week 2 when they faced Russell Wilson, and that just happens to coincide to when they traded for Minkah Fitzpatrick. But if you look at Jared Goff's season, it's been one where he's either been a really strong fantasy option or he poops all over the field. He's finished as QB 12 once and then QB 8 or better 4 other times. So he has 5 QB1 performances. But he has 3 performances where he ranked as QB 28, QB 23, and QB 29. Those 3 games were against Carolina, Cleveland, and San Francisco. All 3 of those teams rank in the top 12 in pressure rate this year. Meanwhile, during his good performances, only one of them featured an opponent with a top half of the league pressure rate. And then if you look at Pittsburgh, they rank only behind San Francisco in pressure rate this year. So I'm a little bit worried about what's going to happen to Jared Goff and this Rams offense. I'd say he's more of a mid-range QB2 rather than a low-end QB1. And then I'm definitely a little bit worried as well with Kirk Cousins going on the road against Dallas, especially with Adam Thielen expected to miss the game. Dallas hasn't faced a ton of good quarterbacks this year, but they did go up against Aaron Rodgers and Carson Wentz over their last 4 games, and they held them to mediocre fantasy days. Dallas has actually allowed the 6th lowest yards per attempt rate this year, while giving up the 5th fewest fantasy points to opposing passers. Minnesota's implied team total isn't that bad in this game, and that should make Cousins fine enough, but without Thielen, I think there's enough reason to bench him. Given what we saw from the Bills and how they used Devin Singletary last week, I think we're safe to trust him as an RB2 moving forward. And against Cleveland in a game where Buffalo's a 2.5-point underdog, you can feel good about Singletary seeing the field quite a bit since he's been used heavily as a receiver this year. So if it's a neutral game script for them, it's only logical to think that Devin Singletary will see a lot of touches once again. But last week, Singletary saw over 64% of Buffalo's running back carries while maintaining a 20% target share. That target share number wasn't anything new. He had that same exact share the previous week, but the 64.5% running back rush share was almost double his previous season high. And Singletary also saw 2 goal line rushes last week, and he converted one of them for a touchdown, whereas Frank Gore saw 3, and he wasn't able to find the end zone. That may shift things in Singletary's favor even more. Now, another player who saw a nice uptick in usage last week was Ronald Jones, and I think we're at the point where he should also be started as an RB2. Jones saw a season-high 78% of Tampa Bay's running back carries this past week, and now the Bucs are facing Arizona as 4.5-point favorites in a game, according to FanDuel Sportsbook, with a 51-point over-under. So there could be scoring in this game, and the Bucs may not be playing from behind. That's the perfect recipe for a running back, especially one who's seeing more and more usage. And my deep desperation play this week at running back is Gus Edwards. The Bengals have allowed the 6th most rushing yards to running backs this year. The Ravens are 9.5-point favorites, and they've got one of the higher implied team totals on this slate. Edwards has played 40.7%, 37.3%, and 40% of Baltimore snaps over his last 3 games. He was typically hovering in the mid to upper 20s in snap share prior to week 6. Now that hasn't led to drastically different rush share numbers, but it's a sign that he's on the field more. That's the first step in generating more fantasy points. He's absolutely a desperation play, though. I wouldn't be using Edwards over players with locked-in roles in their offenses. But if things go south for Cincinnati, which is very possible given their quarterback situation and the matchup, then Edwards could get some run in this game. Now, as for running backs that I'm a little bit lower on versus the consensus, I'm just going to go back to Joe Mixon. Like I just talked about, Cincinnati's got a new quarterback under center. They're huge underdogs. They have the 2nd lowest implied team total on the slate, and Baltimore's allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs over the last 5 weeks. To make things worse, Mixon's seen a double-digit percentage target share in just 2 games this year. It's tough to have a lot of confidence in Mixon. And then there's LaShawn McCoy. As I talked about on the 10 Trends show yesterday, Damian Williams played his highest snap rate of the year on Sunday while handling 3/4 of the Chiefs' running back rushes. McCoy has now hit a 50% snap share just once this season, and he's really only been super usable in 3 weeks. I just think there's a good bit of risk rolling him out this week after what we saw from Damian Williams last week and his usage. But it is understandable if you have no other choice in this running back landscape. Now, at wide receiver this week, I love me some Christian Kirk. He disappointed in a tough matchup last week against San Francisco, but Tampa Bay is the opposite of that type of matchup. They've allowed the most fantasy points in the league to opposing wide receivers, and then on top of that, they've watched over 34% of the targets against them go to the slot. That's a well above average rate, and that's where Kirk has played about 74% of his snaps this year, according to Pro Football Focus. So Larry Fitzgerald is in play too as a result, but I'm just calling out Kirk since he's seen a more consistent target share in that offense. Despite his poor performance last week, he still saw roughly 22% of Arizona's targets. Another pair of teammates who should be okay enough to start this week are Robbie Anderson and Jamison Crowder. Now, I missed on Anderson last week in what seemed like, on paper, the perfect matchup, and volume was there to match that. Anderson had seen 3 straight games with at least a 20% target share in the Jets' offense. So naturally, during my hell week, he saw just 11% of the team's targets. Crowder is the higher floor play given his usage this year, but I'm specifically talking about Anderson here since most of you are probably more on the fence with him. The Giants not only have allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to wide receivers this season though, but they've also allowed the 5th most receptions on passes that travel 15 or more air yards. And we know that at least historically, Anderson is a big play receiver. He's actually 3rd in the NFL in deep ball targets since Sam Darnold returned from mono. He just hasn't done a lot with those targets because the Jets haven't been able to move the ball. But that can change in a matchup like this. You just have to hope that last week was more of an anomaly than how things are going to be for the Jets moving forward. Meaning, yes, they'll be bad. The Jets' offense probably won't be very good for the rest of the season. But hopefully they won't be that bad. I've got a couple of deep plays for you guys this week too, since I know that there are a lot of buys. The first one is Ted Ginn. Now, I don't feel great about it because the last time we saw Ted Ginn play, he had about a 5% target share. But he ran the second most routes on the Saints, and he gets the perfect matchup in Week 10 with Drew Brees back. Atlanta's had arguably the worst defense in secondary in football this year, and over 72% of the receiving yards that they've allowed have gone to wide receivers. That's the highest mark in the league. So in a high-scoring game, Ted Ginn is a decent deep play. Another waiver wire type play this week is Deebo Samuel. He's run the second most routes for San Francisco over the team's last 2 games behind only Emmanuel Sanders, and he's now seen 16%, 14%, and 19% of the 49ers targets in each of his last 3. That's as long as you forget that miserable monsoon game against Washington. But those numbers were 13% or lower in 3 of his first 4. Basically what I'm saying is things are trending up for Deebo, and his matchup against Seattle isn't a bad one. As I mentioned earlier, the Seahawks haven't been that great against the pass, despite going up against a pretty mediocre schedule. Now, in that same game, if you have Tyler Lockett, you're probably going to be playing Tyler Lockett, and I think he should be in your lineup. But I'm lower on him versus the consensus this week, where they have him as a top 10 wideout. San Francisco has obviously been good defensively. They're allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to enemy wide receivers. But specifically, they've been good against slot guys, which is where Tyler Lockett has played over 70% of his snaps from this year. On the season, just 23% of targets are going to pass catchers in the slot against San Francisco. That's the second lowest rate in the league. They've allowed the second fewest yards to the slot and the fewest receptions, and they've only allowed 1 touchdown. It's not the greatest spot in the world for Tyler Lockett, but like I said, if you've got him, you probably have to play him given his ability and his role in this offense. Tyrell Williams is another guy who could be in store for a down game. He'll likely see Casey Hayward when he faces the Chargers on Thursday night, and Hayward ranks 7th best according to PFF in quarterback rating allowed when looking at relevant cornerbacks. And he's allowed just 211 yards and 1 touchdown this year off of 33 targets. So basically, it's not an easy matchup for Tyrell Williams, who actually saw a dip in target share this past week. There are a few tight end streamers that you could use this week with 2 of them in the same game. The first is Jack Doyle. He's seen a double-digit percentage target share in every game since week 1. There could be no T.Y. Hilton in this contest against Miami. And he ran the 11th most routes at tight end last week, and it was 10 more routes than teammate Eric Ebron. And the matchup is there. Miami has allowed 21.7% of their receiving yards to go to the tight end position, which is one of the higher marks in football. So in PPR formats, I think Doyle's not a bad high floor option. In that same game, though, is Mike Gesicki. He saw 6 targets last week, and he now has a double-digit percentage target share in 3 of his last 4. And Indianapolis has sort of been a team under this new coaching regime over the last 2 years that's been pretty good at defending wideouts, or at least proportionally, while struggling against tight ends in the middle of the field. This season specifically, almost 26% of the targets that they've faced have gone to tight ends, whereas they have one of the lowest rates of targets against them when it comes to wide receivers. Without Preston Williams in that lineup, Gesicki could see some work. And then there's Jared Cook. He's still available on a lot of waiver wires, but with Drew Brees back, we should feel a little more optimistic about his involvement in this offense. The last time we saw Cook back in week 6, he ran 30 routes and he was able to find the end zone. In a good matchup against Atlanta in a high-scoring game, Jared Cook is a very solid option this week. Now, defensively for Week 10, if Baltimore's on your waiver wire, get them. But I don't want to dig into that matchup because it's obvious. As is Indianapolis to a degree. They're 10.5-point favorites. Ryan Fitzpatrick has thrown a pick in all but 1 game this year, and the Dolphins are being sacked at the 3rd highest rate in football. You could look at the New York Giants, though, as a deeper play. At first, I was going to talk about Tampa Bay, but my brain is telling me to go with the Giants. The Jets have been sacked at the highest rate in football this year, and even last week, Sam Darnold was sacked 3 times against Miami. Meanwhile, the Giants have actually been pretty average in pressure rate this year, so they may be able to get to Darnold. I think I prefer them slightly to Tampa Bay right now, but both of them are in play as deeper streaming options. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Late Round QB. We've got the mailbag show tomorrow, so I'll talk to you then.